The Spin-Off Podcast Network. Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-Off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. No mai hoki mai kia The Fold e mihi ne ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. Welcome to the final episode of The Fold for 2021, and what I think. Actually, I haven't checked, but vibes right. That is what I think is going to become an annual tradition. I'm going to try and sum up the year in Aotearoa media in a monopod. So if you came here to hear a nice interview with a guest who'll say interesting things, apologies, that's not him today. It's just me. And obviously, inherently, what I'm about to talk about will be limited. You just can't fit the whole of this unruly beast into one podcast. So yeah, and necessarily we'll focus on, I guess, what you might call the sort of the bigger media outlets, with the sort of mass reach outlets, and also on the sort of the just things that change, things that felt like significant. I'm going to miss things. I have not prepped for this as much as I would like, but so again, all those caveats aside, I think hopefully it'll be a good time. I'm going to whip into it shortly. Before I do, I just want to thank our sponsors, Vodafone, whose network technology underpins the Spin-Off, whose network technology we're recording on right now, and I just cannot thank them enough for sponsoring The Fold. Without it, I couldn't possibly do this, and I'm very grateful to be able to. So 2021, it's very strange to think about, but 18 months ago, the New Zealand's media was in an extremely perilous spot. The most intense data point around that was obviously the sale of Stuff, a 150-year-old combination of a ton of different newspapers employing hundreds of people with a massive audience, sold for $1. There were newspapers week after week after week with almost no advertising in them. This thing was very, very scary. NBR could afford to buy an ad in the 6 o'clock news. Like this was weird times. And we're now 18 months on, and with the exception of the Bauer implosion, which was probably the other big data point around that time, they sort of bookended the lockdown, those two events. This thing feels fine, and it's almost eerie, and I'll get into some of that shortly. But a lot of media is either privately held or doesn't disclose its account, so we can only really go off the results of a few companies to get a sense of how the media that is domiciled here is tracking. And the two. There are sort of three big results which sort of suggest it's in better health than anyone would have anticipated. TVNZ delivered its biggest profit in years this year. NZME did the same. They're debt-free, I think, for the first time in a long time. Their share price is up around tenfold since its March, April 2020 doldrums. And there was just recently a profit upgrade for Sky, which saw a big share price jump for them. So you get a sense that those what you might call the legacy media, and that term was used quite derisively to sort of suggest that their time was finished. Well, it's not over just yet, I think, is what those results say. And what they also say is underneath that, there is significant, albeit probably a little bit later than you'd hope, digital transformation happening. The NZME's starting to show really significant numbers of pure online subscribers now. That's a really big thing for its Herald product. And the The radio stations remain resilient, obviously led by the powerhouse that is News Talk ZB. TVNZ On Demand continues to be the preeminent local video on demand platform, and Neon is becoming pretty much a must-have for any sort of serious streaming person. And there's a sort of the two things that you see there are resilience, a surprising resilience for the traditional products. Basically, what that means is people who are over about 50, 55 have not changed their habits particularly radically. They are still basically doing what they did before, and they've got all the money and the assets. That's not entirely true, but it's largely true, which means they're a great audience to advertise to. So the combination of and that money can be recycled into building out digital ventures. So what I'll do today is kind of try and drill into these companies or market segments in a little bit more detail. Again, I'm going to miss things, but broadly speaking, that is the picture that you can feel at this end from those bigger companies, is that they're doing a lot better than anyone anticipated. So I'll talk about them in turn shortly, but I kind of want to talk about some of the big thematics before then. The big thing that happened to journalism this year was the launch of the Public Interest Journalism Fund. It's a very large sum of money to hit journalism all at the same time, $50 million over 3 years, and the first roughly $20 million is, if not dispersed, it's allocated. So you're starting to really see what is going on with that. So the Public Interest Journalism Fund was announced during a time when media was in quite a state. It was, in some ways, it was a pure reaction to that it was about sustainability for a media sector that felt like it had just been declining pretty steadily for probably the thick end of 15 years. And I don't think it's completely irrelevant to these good results that the Public Interest Journalism Fund exists, even though a lot of them are accounting for a period before it actually dispersed any funds. I say that because what the fund does is fund both projects and roles and some kind of development opportunities that, while you can't, it's very hard to profit from them as such. They're it's product, it's journalists making stories for different mediums that you can package up and do your normal kind of commercial operations around. And it's been a lot for everyone involved. And to be honest, I think the timeline between its announcement in February and it having to figure out what it was, appoint someone, Raywin Rash, to lead it, and then to start dispersing funds in a very short space of time was one of the craziest things that's happened to this industry. And it was impossible to do it in a way where you weren't going to have some growing pains there. The thing that I think has been manifest about it is that while it was initially announced as a sort of a sustainability measure, once it was up and rolling, it also kind of gained elements of wanting to fulfill some bigger governmental goals around representation of a more diverse range of journalists and journalisms, and a greater respect for te tiriti. And the process of doing that has, it's not always been easy. Like, one of the things it's trying to fix in some respects is the fact that journalism has been a much more Pākehā, both in terms of the audience it serves and those who make it for a long period of time. But it's trying to solve all of that very quickly, in the sense that there are a lot more roles for Māori and Pacific journalists in particular than there, at times it can feel like there are more of those roles than there are journalists to fill them. So it's not been uncomplicated figuring this out. Extremely noble intentions. Maybe some of the timing was the staging could have been different. But I think overall, if you start to sort of look at the what our media, not our media, our journalism in the broader sense of the word is starting to emphasize, the stories it's starting to tell, you can already kind of feel it. Like there is a sense that particular story beats, particular communities are just more prominent and there's more of it than there used to be. And I think that is starting to transform journalism and will ultimately transform it for the much, much better. That was the sort of the big story of the first half of the year in some respects, and then has flowed throughout. The one that's happened much more recently is the request for I should be very delicate how I phrase this. The NPA leading a request to the Commerce Commission for permission to collectively bargain with the technology giants. This basically follows what happened in Australia, where their competition regulator essentially, with legislation alongside it, essentially forced Google and Facebook to come to deals with the major media organizations over there. They initially thought that they could, ignore that, and Facebook famously turned off news over there for about a week with a hurricane bearing down on the coast. That didn't go very well. They turned news back on and ultimately made deals. Google threatened to withdraw search. Microsoft said, cool, that sounds like a good new market for us. Again, they backed down from that and made deals. They are trying desperately to make that just a thing that happened in Australia, and that isn't setting a precedent for everywhere else. What we're saying, what we're hoping to be given permission to do, is say, well, actually, you can't negotiate a bunch of deals with a very closely related market in Australia, where New Zealanders come and go from it constantly, and expect that massive flood of money not to have an impact on our ability to kind of operate here. The situation here is different. There isn't, as of right now, a sort of threat of imminent legislation. We'll see how that plays out. But what it really kind of boils down to is an attempt, and you see this in a lot of places. You see it in the number of Senate hearings there have been for the likes of Facebook and Google and Amazon over the past few months in the US, an attempt for society to start to figure out, you guys have gotten awfully big here. You're now turning over more than the entire country of New Zealand is making in GDP, combined. So, and you're not really paying any tax, and we haven't really paid any attention or regulated you. What are we doing here exactly? Like this, we've got people marching on Parliament who seem to have like a mind virus where they're refusing to take a vaccine that will save their lives. And that seems to be a very, very profitable enterprise spreading that information, and it's by no means to say that Google and Facebook are, all bad or even net bad by any means. But it is to say that this thing is complicated, and our absence of having done some really serious thinking about it in an all of society way is really starting to hurt us. And this is, as Google and Facebook frequently say, I should say, use Google and Facebook's products every day, have great relationships with people there. This is by no means personal. This is just something that is overdue to my mind. But this is basically, I think, the part of Google and Facebook would say that news and journalism is a tiny part of what they do. I think that's probably true in some broad sense. I also think it probably understates the value of what news brings to their platforms in different ways. So we'll see how that plays out. But ultimately, what those two things, the Public Interest Journalism Fund, which was basically the government knowing, seeing that journalism was in such a parlous state that it needed subsidising, and then at the other end, the news industry saying, something is wrong here. We need to strike similar deals to that which you did in Australia. It sort of shows in a way that this whole industry, the whole business model that underpins it, is in a state of flux, that it is in motion, that the tide is really starting to run on it. Because really, when you boil it down to it, like those great results that I talked about earlier for TVNZ and NZME and Sky and so on, what's driven that is not really digital revenues. Like I haven't studied the numbers, but this is just broadly true of all media, is that the digital side is predominantly made up of content, TV shows, films, and news stories, etc., which is funded by, subsidized by, created by, functionally by the traditional business model still. So, TV advertising, newsprint advertising. And everyone knows that thing is declining. It's really just a matter of how fast. And it's still now declining faster than the new revenue is replacing it. So these forces are just too large to be resisted. So as a society, you basically have to accept at a certain point, either we just want less journalism and are prepared, less journalism, but also less TV shows, less. Well, what's your favourite media? If it comes from New Zealand, the funding mechanism for it is broken, and New Zealand on Airs is broadly static. So, or look at the Public Interest Journalism Fund. Taxpayers just have to start paying for it. Those two things are the options, and then there's a third way, which is the technology companies, which have sort of taken over the control of the revenue streams. Google and Facebook alone take something like 70 cents in every dollar spent in the digital advertising space, whereas New Zealand publishers take about 10 cents. So you can kind of see that the scale of these things is just, they barely. They just can't even fit on the same graph, to be honest. That will be a really, really interesting and long-running, I think that's going to be a decade-long story. I don't think that these settlements that were made in Australia, and regardless of the outcome of what happens here, I don't think that is the end of it. I think there'll be a decade-long reckoning with what the best way to tax, regulate, and sort of fund those elements of society that used to be self-sustaining is. And it's also by no means just a pure journalism story. We ran an op-ed by Andrew Schusterman, who's GM at South Pacific Pictures, about the extent to which Netflix, which has just come from nowhere, wasn't even here in 2014, to be one of the most watched channels, if you will, in New Zealand, about how it has almost no New Zealand content on it. And for the local production industry and for the people charged with, who view culture as something which knits this country together, knits all the diverse strands of us into one piece. They're starting to say Netflix should have a quota, like the one the voluntary quota, which massively increased the amount of Aotearoa music played on our radio stations 20 years ago. There is an argument for that. I think there's a lot still to come in this space, and it's it feels like it's starting to happen because it's not just here. In Canada's essentially replicating Australia's bargaining code. There will be, France has got its own work happening there. The EU is starting to be very aggressive in the way that it regulates and scrutinises the big technology companies. This is the big media story. So that's what I feel like the sort of big thematic story is this year. And now we'll take a quick break and I'll come back to talk about some of the big companies and what happened to them. The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
Welcome back to the fold. I'll just go through sort of a few of the big media entities and sort of sectors and kind of give a quick appraisal of them. As I mentioned before, I'll start with NZME, which, as I said before, publishes the Herald and owns a bunch of radio stations and digital assets like the Herald website and One Roof. It has been basically on a big decline for a while. It had a very heavy debt load, which it cleared this year. And I think a lot of these big companies go through periods of feeling like they're not quite sure what they are. And I think often that's the outside perception. Certainly TVNZ felt that way maybe 4 or 5 years ago in a way that it now feels very confident of its identity. And I think the Herald felt that sort of slightly mixed up thing for a while. And often that's, that can be because the work is happening behind the scenes and the decisions have been made. They just take a while to filter out into organisations at scale. And the big thing that the Herald was doing was a sort of a technology and almost business philosophy change. When you go from being a free site that is just trying to chase the maximum possible eyeballs to still doing that, but also very much trying to be a subscription site that wants the maximum possible subscribers, that is a big thing for your organisation to process. And, I would still argue, and I've said this before, that those things are not purely compatible. Like, when you have Daily Mail type stories out front, not all of them, but certainly a smattering of them on your homepage and on social media at any given time, those things don't necessarily perfectly cohere with the kind of rigorous, serious analysis and journalism that you're expecting people to pay for. That is, basically exclusively behind your paywall. But certainly you can't really argue with the results. They had a fantastic year financially. And there's one transaction, I think, which shows what they're doing and kind of gives a hint of, where they are at as an organisation. And that was their purchase of Business Desk, which was like maybe a couple of weeks ago. Business Desk was one of, I think, the most impressive new in inverted commas, entrance into the market in quite some time. I say new because it's actually been around for a decade as a newswire service, but it was reinvented and relaunched as a subscription product in March of 2020. That's a date you'll remember because it was the day the world went to hell, basically. A really, really brutal time to launch anything, let alone a business publication, when business was basically put on ice for 2 months afterwards. But I have to credit Patrick Smelly, Matt Martell, and Brian Gaynor, who was an investor who led that. They really, really worked that product like hell. They built a great team, and the thing was doing really, really well. They had a reported 10,000 subscribers, which is, if that's a like-for-like comparison, and subscriber can be a nebulous term. It can, be anything from someone who subscribes to an email to someone who's giving you hundreds of dollars a year. But they claimed 10,000 subscribers recently, which is double what the NBR has had at various times, or albeit at a different price point. They had just built a really strong, coherent product and a recognizable brand in a very short space of time. And NZME, which also has a very strong business offering, saw that and purchased it for $5 million if the whole earnout goes right. And that's pretty smart stuff, like if business is a really core part of the Herald's offering, this gives them a second channel through which they can run that business content. It also gives them a more specialized offering. It gives you work that you can bundle up together. They really have an opportunity to dominate business coverage in a way that it just makes a lot of sense for them. Obviously there remain competitors out there. Interest still does actually a great and quite specialized job. The NBR, NBR is a great publication sometimes in spite of what its ownership tries to do. Stuff feels like it's de-emphasized business somewhat in favor of its, the kind of more social justice in a broad sense journalism that fits with its mission of being a Guardian-style donation-driven model. But Business Desk looks like a really great buy, and it saw its share price go up, I think 7%, which is more than basically the value of the company went up by more than what they paid for Business Desk. That's always a sign that people think you did a smart thing. Stuff, as I mentioned before, is for a company that was sold for $1, Stuff has a lot of energy right now. It's recruiting a lot of really smart, driven young journalists. The whole feel of its homepage, all of its products is just a lot more considered, a lot more mission-driven than it was before. I think if you look at Potiaki as the kind of year zero of its of the new stuff emerging, that thread has continued. The extent to which it centres stories from Te Ao Māori in its coverage is just night and day versus where it was a few years ago. So the sort of Sinead Boucher as owner era of Stuff is really rolling now. I went to an event in May where they were sort of celebrating their Voyager wins, and they sort of presented a new brand that was kind of freaked me out a bit because we were working on our new brand. It didn't look like massively different. They haven't really rolled that out yet, but it's absolutely coming, and you can sense that there is a level of consideration for design, for imagery, just a level of care with stuff that is just not the kind of more tabloid version of what they were a few years ago. They also had an acquisition, albeit a smaller and more nascent operation in Ensemble, which is a sort of fashion and style site founded by Rebecca Wadey and Zoe Awawoka. And again, I thought that was a really, really smart acquisition, gives them a product that can go up against Viva, and just had a very similar kind of feel, really beautifully designed, and they've already kind of integrated that into the rest of their stable quite well. They sort of guest edited an issue of Sunday Magazine, for example, and most of their newspapers have had redesigns in recent times and are looking sharper as a result. That's the two big print organisations. In television, I've sort of talked about TVNZ a lot lately, so I might leave them and Discovery, obviously, because I'm interviewing Kate Slater and Glenn Kine, but both of them, huge rush of energy this year too. A lot of work and a lot of change. Obviously, the big thing with TVNZ is Kevin Kenrick announcing that he's stepping down early next year. It'll be very interesting to see who takes that role. They will be in, odds on to take over a combined TVNZ RNZ, which is very imminent. The announcement on that, I think it's functionally an inevitability. RNZ, on some level is in a bit of a holding pattern, waiting to find out exactly what's happened there. It did launch Tahi, its youth brand. It had the feel of a kind of a soft launch. This is the thing that just before the pandemic, around the start of 2020, they announced as taking over Concert FM, and there was a huge backlash to that. And I think that meant this operation was always in a bit of a tough spot. So RNZ and TVNZ, while making great products, are also in some ways stymied from pushing out and on the same way that the likes of Stuff and the Herald can. The last one I want to talk about in terms of the major organisations is MediaWorks, which was cleaved off from 3 and the company that's become known as Discovery. Basically, bang on a year ago, Cam Wallace took over as CEO, and it just went straight into a really gnarly scandal, or scandals. It had the Sean Plunkett affair where him and John Banks and Peter Williams have at various times said stuff that just shouldn't really be said by any credible person on air. All have since left the station. Sean Plunkett is now talking about starting an operation called The Platform, which honestly I'm kind of curious about. We'll see how that goes. And then immediately after that, or even around the same time, there were just a series of sort of sexual harassment, even into sexual assault allegations, which largely came out of an anonymous Instagram account called Beneath the Glass Ceiling, an anonymous Instagram account. And, that was very much a kind of welcome to hell entree for Cam Wallace, who, these things are very serious, but to be fair to him, he'd come in from Air New Zealand and none of it happened on his watch. I think you find out the character of an executive by how they respond to that. And, he got Maria Dew to do an inquiry into the harassment and assault allegations. That report was released. These things are never released, maybe an executive summary. I think that was really significant. And there was an absolute broom went through Magic Talk, which functionally won't exist shortly. So I think probably the signal achievement, like that stuff all comes under the banner of fixing some long-standing issues, which is, important, but also not what you came to do. What you came to do is build. And the thing they built is Today FM, which is a new radio station replacing Magic Talk, arriving in 2022. And honestly, just incredible recruiting into that. Tova O'Brien to go head-to-head with Mike Hosking at 6 o'clock, Lloyd Bird to take Drive, Mark Richardson coming off the AM show. Like there's a bunch of, and Leah Panapa is basically the sole holdover from the original Magic Talk, and rightly so. That's the one you'd want to keep. So you've basically just got a very refreshed, galvanized lineup to take on the sort of seemingly immovable incumbent that is News Talk ZB. Dallas Gurney has done a brilliant job putting that thing together. Really excited to see that. And I think in general, MediaWorks probably had the hardest year, but in some respects, in terms of that recruiting piece, which is so important in a talent-driven industry like radio, they've done brilliantly, and correspondingly made it very, very difficult for their former sibling at 3, who gave up a lot of that talent in those deals. Sky, not a lot to say really. They've just Sophie Moroney took over as CEO earlier in the year and has basically killed it. They're making more money. They've done good, smart deals, that they can afford at the right times. They're really pushing Neon hard, and rightly so. It's a terrific product, and they should be able to raise its price, I think, in coming years, to sort of start to bring the, to have a better ability to recoup the cost of those big contracts. And I think there's still a lot to come once the sporting calendar gets more under control. If they can create a great multi-sport platform like KO in Australia, then I think that thing could really go as well. And the sort of the legacy satellite customer does just sort of stick around and tick on. So Sky is, I think, a really interesting, has been seen as the ultimate sunset candidate. They're very much saying that isn't our story, and I think that they're really starting to prove that now. That's all of the big organisations covered, I think. I just want to talk about a few other little sort of smaller organisations and little trends before I go. The thing that's sort of worth keeping an eye on is the rise of Substack. Your regular listeners will remember earlier this year I spoke to Hamish McKenzie, who's the New Zealander and who was a co-founder of that. Substack is an email subscription product which you can basically pay to get newsletters. It's been one of the biggest stories of media over the past year or so. They've recruited some very big names. They're not uncontroversial. Some people think that they are a place where sort of toxic opinions are go out unmodulated. That might be true at times, but I think the real story is a bit more complex than that. And certainly in terms of the, independent creator economy kind of piece, they were real innovators, and they're rightly highly valued and scrutinized. But the point, I think, in terms of the local angle is that that's starting to hit here. They, David Farrier's Webworm has been a huge hit, and I think a lot of people both here and overseas read it. Dylan Cleaver left the Herald as a head of sport to start his own Substack, The Bounce, which is honestly might be my favorite new media product of the year, full stop. I think Dylan writes beautifully and passionately, and got one monster scoop in Carl Heyman, a very recent All Black, younger than me, revealing that he's battling dementia. But he also just, anytime there's a cricket match or an All Black test, you get a really heady, funny, cerebral analysis in your inbox the next morning. Could not recommend subscribing to The Bounce more. Emily Wrights, who's former spin-off writer and still sometimes spin-off writer and good friend of the site, has got her own highly successful Substack, as does Bernard Hickey with the Kaka, who writes about sort of the political economy. He obviously does the When the Facts Change podcast with us. That kind of thing feels like it's going to keep happening. I think if you have a sufficient combination of big name, big social audience, high metabolism, and a willingness and risk tolerance, that's the kind of profile of people that could get into it. And obviously you have to have a sort of well-demarked audience to go to as well. But I think that's something that you should absolutely keep your eye on. I want to shout out an Instagram account here, Shit You Should Care About. I mean, there's so much more than an Instagram account. We've been kind of collaborating, sort of incubating them all year, though they are very much an independent organisation run by Lucy Blackiston with her friends, Liv and Ruby. They're just a really, really smart and innovative I don't even know what you call them, and that's kind of the beauty of it. Are they a news organization? They make a bunch of stuff. They make newsletters. They obviously have this tremendously powerful Instagram with 3.5 million followers, probably more than that. Forgive me for getting it wrong. But they do podcasts, which might be, will be some of the most listened to podcasts to come out of this country. Lucy writes a newsletter that is just extremely entertaining and well put together every day. And they basically feel like they're free and creative and well-defined and sort of just built for an audience that has just grown up on the internet. And the idea of having sort of national boundaries or subject boundaries is just kind of anathema and doesn't really make sense. And so I find the process of both collaborating with them on products like Extremely Online, the show we made together with Hickswick Productions, our sister company, but also just genuinely absorbing the product. I think the way that it takes really important issues and makes them accessible to people who wouldn't maybe naturally sit down and consume news with all its sort of self-seriousness and so on is something that our whole industry could learn from. And allow me a minute to indulge the spin-off story this year. We've been super busy. We founded Daylight Creative, a content studio which has had an incredible year under the leadership of Lee Lowndes. Won some really great business, done a whole bunch of really great work. Swelled to sort of 20-odd people. It's been very, very difficult working through lockdowns and so on, but really, really enjoyed and been impressed by watching that. And on the editorial side, we transitioned from Toby Manhire, an extraordinary shift as editor, to Madeline Chapman. I'll get her on in the early new year to sort of talk about that role. Had a whole bunch of new people come in on the editorial side too, and grown out things like technology, data journalism, and a whole bunch more, which has been really, really kind of thrilling to watch and also exhausting. and we did a lot of that planning just before the lockdown. And so, it got tense there for a minute. And I want to thank our members for really basically saving our ass and having our back again. Obviously, podcast has grown a lot under Jane. And the really big thing for us has been launching our new website, which I think, in terms of its performance, its look, its feel, what it encourages us to do, the way that live updates work on it, we're just so thrilled with it. And, I think that it feels like it embodies our sort of ambition and what we want to be doing in these next few years, and feels like a platform where that you can play there in a way that's really exciting. So, sorry, forgive me that indulgence, but we have been busy this year, and I'm really excited to see how all that plays out in the new year, when we'll be kicking on. So, look, that's kind of, obviously there are whole chunks of our media, from the magazine sector to Māori media, which I haven't even been able to particularly touch here. Really, really interesting things happening and basically all across it. And I guess that's the sort of paradox of where we are right now, is I feel like there's really interesting stuff happening all across it. Like there is a push towards digitalization. There are generations of young, wildly talented journalists coming on board who are just very intuitive users of the kind of current communication means. Plenty in our organization, but you honestly see them everywhere. And, this thing has the makings of a really vibrant and vital industry, which is what it's always been, essentially. And yet it also still feels on some level existentially threatened. There's a reason why it took a huge, effectively government subsidy into it, because it was just falling apart. I think 600 journalists lost their jobs last year, for example. And, that's why the sort of stakes feel still for all of this new energy and for all these kind of windfall profits that came out of the sort of weirdness of of last year, that this thing doesn't feel solved, and that's why these discussions, if we're able to have them with Google or Facebook, remain so urgent, because the long-term trend is baked in, and it's not going anywhere. And the job, as much as it's an exciting one, it gets harder. That march on Parliament was a terrifying thing, where it was just journalists. It was that same kind of imported, terrifying rhetoric from the US of politicians and journalists allies who are out to hurt you and your country. And, we've had people walk into our offices off the street saying stuff that, is pretty freaky. We've had, you just have to look at the comments on anything which covers COVID to know, the kind of quality of the information systems that are out there. We've seen, journalists assaulted this year. And that's, I guess, why this industry, which I feel like, as much as it will, annoy people and we will make mistakes just because of the pace and scale we're working at. But fundamentally, when I do believe that the whole of journalism is working to try and bring truth and light to important stories, and that if there's more of it and more to counter the kind of waves of disinformation on social media, that can only be a good thing for this country. And that figuring this thing out is an issue of national significance, and that as much as we annoy politicians, I think they know it too. There's a reason why we're being bundled together. And New Zealand has this somehow, and I'm sure that some people will disagree with this, but I really believe it, has quite a beautiful media culture and a beautiful political culture, and those things feed off one another. And if you look at that on a world scale, it's just different here. And I think we should fight for that, and we should want it to kind of continue. And so figuring out how to pay for it and how to distribute it and all of that really matters. So that's kind of why I remain sort of fascinated by this topic, but also I think that these kind of conversations we're having, these things we're trying to figure out really matter. That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.